just start this by saying possibly the most controversial statement of the Thomas fandom. I don't like Thomas as an E2. I don't like it one bit. I don't know if you noticed, but the E2s are f***ing huge, and Thomas is not. I'm sorry, but Thomas should not be the same height as Gordon. That's just visually wrong on so many levels. I can't deal with it. Audrey may have said that Thomas was an E2 in the iOS book, but I think the illustrations speak otherwise. Thomas was an E2 in his first book, and only in the first edition of that book in the unedited Reginald Payne illustrations. In those, he has the dipped running board, the extended tanks, the LBSER-styled sloped smokebox saddle, the single open cab window, and is sometimes shown to be quite long. Thomas being an E2 was purely a creation of illustrator Reginald Payne, who was a Southern man and used pictures of a Southern E2 for the illustrations, going against Audrey's wishes of him being a J50. We all know Audrey didn't envision Thomas as an E2, and that's clear by the way Thomas is consistently drawn in all the books following. Hell, even in the Dalby revisions of the first book, Audrey had him take away some of the distinct E2 features. He raised the running board, removed the saddle, and gave him an extra cab window. If Audrey claims Thomas is an E2, why did he have Dalby go to the trouble of taking away specifically E2 features? My theory is that Audrey secretly never liked the E2 idea and tried to suppress it. And that's evident later on in Thomas Comes to Breakfast, when he wrote a whole story just to send Thomas away to get the dip and the running board removed, and become even less E2-like. So I wanted to carry that over into how I portrayed Thomas. Thomas is in spirit a small 060 tank engine, similar to the size of a Ginty or something. So when it comes to my models, I like to try to stick to what's available ready to run and weigh my options. Unfortunately, we're pretty limited to acceptable candidates for Thomas when it comes to ready to run 060s. My first idea was to modify a Ginty and extend the tanks. I did a Photoshop of that, but wasn't super happy with the result. Then I tried chopping a J69 using the Finecast kit. Again, wasn't super happy. I finally landed on the E2 being the best option. I had to bite my tongue with that purchase, but I figured it would work for the time until I figured out something better. So I purchased a regular E2 body from Gavin, aka Sparkshot, from his Shapeways shop. If Thomas was going to be an E2, he was going to be outright an E2 with no mods. Yeah, I know, I'm a hypocrite. Going about assembling the thing wasn't too hard. The kit came with all the pieces necessary, barring the handrails and the chassis of course. So the first thing I did was sand the body with fine sandpaper strips. I bought it with an ultra smooth detail finish, which is usually pretty fine from Shapeways as is, but 3D prints are never perfect on the rounded parts. Once the guy was smooth, I sprayed the body with primer. The primer I used is Aged Gray Ultra Matte Spray by Rust-Oleum. I use this primer for everything. It's perfect. You can find it at any store in the States like Walmart or Home Depot. Once the primer dried, I applied the first coat of blue. The paints I use are actually acrylic matte paints from the big art store chain called Blick. Believe it or not, I actually brush paint all of my models. I find that I have much more handle on painting crevices with a paintbrush than I do with a spray. If you spray too much in one area, it'll clump and dry with drip marks. You don't get that with brush paints. The color I chose for my Northwestern blue is called Sapphire. I try to apply coats as thin as possible. Usually it takes 3 coats or so to make sure the blue is totally even. After that, I then painted all the black parts with a black acrylic. This included the smoke box, the running board, and the cab interior. After that came the lining. The lining is 0.35mm red water slide strips from Fox Transfers. Just stick them in water, let them slide off the paper, and apply to the model with a toothpick. It's easy, but time consuming, especially when it comes to rounded corners. The buffers are sprung Southern-style spares from Bachmann. For a time you could order bags of sprung buffers from Hatton's in any of the big 4 styles, but since Hatton's and Bachmann's business split last year, I haven't been able to get more of them, so it's a good thing I stockpiled when I did. The couplings are spare chain links, also from Bachmann. I didn't have a chassis ready for Thomas, so for the time being I used the chassis from an old regular Hornby Thomas. It worked for the time being, but being an old chassis it was very chunky looking, and I planned on swapping it out with a better one later on. Next came his number 1. The number is also a water slide transfer. It was an LMS styled one from a water slide sheet from Hatton's. At this point in time, I also thought it'd be fun to give all my engines BR crests, as the Northwestern was a part of the British Railways network. I soon changed my mind on that and removed them. as the time period for all my models are in preservation era, circa late 60s, early 70s or so. I also later replaced the tiny one with a much bigger one using O-gauge size number transfers from Fox. Once everything paint and decal wise was in place, I gave the model a final coat of matte clear spray to give the model an overall even finish. The brand I use, again, is Rust-Oleum. At last I found a chassis. The E2 body is built to fit on a Bachmann Ginty chassis. Unfortunately, the Ginty is probably the most sought after model out there, as everyone uses its chassis for custom 060s. I couldn't find a Ginty, so I ended up using a Midland 1F I got on a bargain. It has a different motor build to the Ginty, so getting the body to sit flush on it required a little cutting under the smoke box. I added some real coal to the bunker, which is legit real coal. Amazon sells little joke Santa bags of naughty coal, which have real coal in them. I purchased one and literally crushed the coal into small crumbs with a hammer. From just one bag alone, I have an endless supply of real coal for my engines. The final touch is weathering, which again is from real coal. I dip a dry paintbrush into my coal bin and just paint the coal dust onto the model in crevices or anywhere I think makes sense. And voila! The model is done. Assembled, painted, lined, sprayed, and weathered. And that so ends the first part of the story. And for the longest time, this E2 was my Thomas. However, that all changed when I decided to bring this guy into Photoshop. So, even though I made a full-on E2 Thomas, I wasn't happy with it. The length and overall size just bothered me. So a thought occurred to me one day, what if I just took the E2 and shortened it? I did a Photoshop where I took the E2 body and shortened it to fit on a Bachmann Thomas chassis. The end result wasn't half bad. I posted it to Twitter, where it got a lot of attention, including from Gavin himself. Gavin messaged me saying he was interested in making the baby E2 body and needed measurements from the Bachmann Thomas chassis to make it happen. I sent him what I could, and the man delivered. Not long after, Gavin presented Twitter with a baby E2 body that could happily fit on a Bachmann Thomas chassis. And before someone on Twitter inevitably brings it up, this was all way before the recent stuff with Gavin, by the way. I try not to get involved, and I by no means agree with the sort of things that he may say on his social, but I figured I should at least acknowledge that. So of course I ordered a body as soon as I could, and the level of satisfaction I had when I fitted this thing to a chassis for the first time was indescribable. Finally, after all this time, I had a model of Thomas that I was happy with. Around that same time, Rails of Sheffield's exclusive Terrier model hit stores, and the one that I had pre-ordered arrived. And let me tell you, this thing is the worst model I have ever purchased. It's made by Dabble, whose quality control is abysmal for 00 gauge. Trust me, if you want a 00 Terrier, just get a Hornby one. They're so much cheaper and are fantastic runners. When this one arrived, the chassis out of the box had running issues, so I had to take the body off the chassis to mend it. And because of how the stupid thing is designed, I for the life of me could not get the body back onto the chassis. Yeah, I know that sounds really silly, but I seriously couldn't. I got so mad with this that I wrote an angry Twitter rant about it. However, it got me thinking. I now had a brand new 060 chassis ripe for the taking. So curiosity bit me and I tried the Thomas body on it. And shockingly, I thought it looked beautiful. It looked better than the Thomas chassis. The smaller, more spaced out wheels fit the aesthetic of the model much better in my opinion. So I decided to just roll with it. I kept my Bachmann Thomas intact with its chassis, which I'm glad I did because I later modded that into a prop-accurate Thomas. We'll probably talk about that another day. The build process for this model was the same as the Big E2. Primer, several coats of blue, black, red lining from Fox, big ol' number 1, and real coal in the bunker. This is, in my opinion, the perfect Thomas. It's short and the right height for how Thomas is presented in the books and the show, while maintaining the signature E2 features he's known for, namely the extended side tanks and the dipped front running board. And here's the best part about this new Thomas. One of the big selling features of the Rails of Sheffield Terriers are their lit up cabs. So since I used the Terrier chassis for this, Thomas's cab lights up. Pretty damn cool. And that, my friends, is the story of how I came to and built my Thomas. It involved 2 different E2 bodies, a Bachmann Thomas, a Midland 1F, and a stupid, god-awful, terribly constructed Terrier to make it happen. But god damn it, it was worth it. Thomas is one of my favorite models in the whole collection. Not just because of looks, but because of the whole never-ending string of events that led to its ultimate form. I'll be holding on to this little blue guy for the rest of my days. And if any of you are interested in making one for yourself, I have provided Gavin's email in the description for you to contact him. Hope you enjoyed this installment of Doug's Trains, and I'll see you all in the next one.